Well, I've got a couple of stories from when I first made contact with the movement and met Bhante. So I was 21, I think, quite young. I was a student at university, and I came across Buddhism at the University Buddhist Society, not the FWBO. And I fairly quickly became a Buddhist and went to all sorts of weekly lectures by all sorts of visiting speakers, who were mostly academics or Asian people or whatever. And I read a few books. And somewhere along the way, somebody came to speak to us from the London Buddhist Centre. And I was immediately drawn because they were so much younger and so much more sort of vigorous, or I responded to them anyway, so much more strongly than I had these various other teachers. And they were busy building the London Buddhist Centre, and it just was living Buddhism, which I immediately responded to. But I didn't do anything about it because I was a student, but I kind of filed it in the back of my mind. A couple of years later, I finished at university, went to London and looked up the London Buddhist Centre and started getting involved. And it wasn't easy, but I was definitely there to stay. I kind of knew that. And then a few months passed, I don't know how long, maybe 6 months, so I was about 21 at this time. I went back to Cambridge and looked up my old meditation teacher, who was probably in his 50s, a kind of long-time Theravadan Buddhist, English. And I told him I was getting involved with the London Buddhist Centre, Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, and so on. And a sort of cloud came across his face. And I sort of knew it would, but I wanted to tell him, and lo and behold, a cloud came across his face. And I asked him, what he thought. And he said, well, and I don't remember the exact words, but he said, well, I don't approve of Sangharakshita. That's what he said. So I sort of knew this already, but I asked him why. I wanted him to, speak his mind. And he said, well, Sangharakshita has a fundamentally flawed personality. That I do remember, those 3 words, a fundamentally flawed personality. So I asked him why again, and I didn't actually know the answer, what you might say. And I don't remember the words exactly, but basically he said, Bhante, Sangharakshita is homosexual. And that was it. That was the end of all he had to say. So I took that on board, but I still liked the London Buddhist Centre and the people and so on. But I went back there with a certain confusion in my mind, because I didn't know what was true. All I knew was my limited experience and what my old teacher had said. And I kind of went back there, and I started looking for this homosexuality everywhere. I mean, Sangharakshita wasn't there, he lived in Norfolk, but I just started looking everywhere. Maybe they're homosexual. And 2 men talking together, maybe they're homosexual. And I got friendly with these 2 guys who lived in a house around the corner from the London Buddhist Centre. One of them played Go, and I played Go as well, so I went round to play Go one night. And I was really suspicious of them, because they definitely lived in a house together. And maybe they were gay. But they weren't in the least. And so I carried on my quest looking for this homosexuality, and never finding it. And it took quite a long time to sort of, exorcise or get used to that double story. There was the story of my experience and the story of my teacher's story. It was partly confusing because I thought I knew all about Buddhism when I came to the London Buddhist Centre, because I'd been a Buddhist and I'd gone to all these lectures and I'd read quite a few books, which were mostly Pali Canon or Zen. That was the books I came across. And at the London Buddhist Centre was all these stories about all these strange bodhisattvas, Avalokiteshvara, Manjushri, and all these pictures. And I had never heard of them. I just hadn't. And so I couldn't quite believe they were Buddhism, because I thought I knew. I'd been chairman of the University Buddhist Society for a year. So I thought I knew. Surely, if anybody knows, I must know. And it took me a long time to sort of realise the Buddhism I knew was a very small part of the picture, and sort of backtrack and sort of take on board a much bigger picture of Buddhism. So there was that. Maybe 2 years later, I went on a summer retreat up at Pamaloka, and I met Sangharakshita for the first time. And by this time I knew he was homosexual. And I can't quite remember the stories I'd heard to tell me about it. But I went on the retreat knowing he was homosexual and that sometimes he slept with men who were his students. And on the retreat, the opportunity was there to meet Sangharakshita. So most people were, so I thought I will. So I booked an appointment and I went to see him. And I went to see him in a very strange state of a sort of excitement, partly around this sex thing. And I was thinking to myself, whoa, I wonder if he's going to proposition me. And I half hoped he might, and half was terrified he might. But I was sort of on edge because of that possibility, which was definitely a mixture of hoping he would and hoping he wouldn't. So we met in his study at Pamaloka, surrounded by books and all sorts of little objects he'd collected. And to be quite frank, we had a perfectly ordinary, rather boring talk about this and that and the other. And I actually didn't have any particular questions to ask, and he didn't have any particular teachings to give. So it was quite cordial, but quite boring, really. And I went away wondering what all that was about, but feeling this strange, deflating mixture of half relief and half disappointment. So that was my first meeting with Bhante. I met him a couple of times after that in similar situations, and it was just the same. Nothing special happened, except I felt more at ease and enjoyed the meeting much more, and began to feel a little sort of rapport between us. So after that, I've got one more little story about Bhante from some years later, which I've never been able to make sense of in my mind. And I must have been about 27 perhaps, and I'd asked for ordination, and I was going through what's called the ordination selection procedure or process. And there was an annual retreat at Pamaloka where everybody who wanted to get ordained would come, and a team of order members was assembled, and it was their job to make recommendations to Bhante. And this happened once a year, so this was your chance for the year. And it was, to be honest, a highly stressed event. It was, everybody was pushing for attention and desperate to know what was going to happen, and everybody was stressed. I could only see it from my point of view, that I was stressed, because I was wanting to get ordained and not knowing what might happen, but everyone was stressed. And about halfway through, the message came to me, Bhante would like to meet you. And this threw me immediately into a state of apprehension, because I took it to mean he wanted to see me because I must be close, otherwise why would he bother? He must have something to ask me. Maybe if I get it right, I'll get ordained. Fantastic. So I went to wait at the bottom of the stairs in the hallway at Pamaloka after lunch, and the procedure was you go for a walk. So at the appointed time I was there with my heart in my mouth and my nerves on edge, and Bhante came down the stairs very slowly and mindfully in his stockinged feet, carrying a pair of shoes in his hand. And he sort of looked down the stairs to see who was waiting, and he saw me. And on his way down he said, hello, nice to see you, or something. And he said, how are you? And I summoned up my courage and summoned up my truth and summoned up everything. And I said, well, Bhante, to be honest, I'm quite sort of stirred up, really. And I thought, great, better to be honest than just conventional. So he said, and he stopped. And he kind of looked at the shoes, and he said, oh, I seem to have brought the wrong pair of shoes. And he turned round, and he padded back up the stairs on his stockinged feet and disappeared. And I waited there, sort of calming myself down. A couple of minutes later he appeared, padded back down the stairs with a pair of shoes which looked exactly the same as the first pair of shoes, but I couldn't be sure. I was in no real state to notice it. Put them on very slowly and mindfully, and off we went for the walk. And I was puzzled because I thought, are they the same pair of shoes or are they the different pair of shoes? And if they're different, how come he forgot them? That's unmindful. And if they're the same, what's going on there? Anyway, off we went for a walk. And the first thing, I thought, let's take the initiative here. I said to him, Bhante, thank you very much for asking to meet me. And I thought he'd tell me what he wanted to know. And he looked a bit puzzled and he said, but I didn't ask to meet you. And I was completely thrown. I had no idea what was going on at that point. Because if I certainly hadn't asked to meet him, and if he hadn't asked to meet me, what were we doing there? And maybe I wasn't anywhere near ordination after all. So I sort of swallowed. But we carried on walking. Bhante didn't seem to mind that he was walking with somebody quite by accident. We carried on and kind of chatted. But at the time, I was going through a big thing about should I leave my wife or not. That was a big thing. And I sort of knew I wanted to, but I was terrified of doing it. So I was able to take that opportunity to tell him what was going on. Not ask for his advice, but just tell him. And the one comment I remember, but I can't remember the exact words, is that he didn't answer me directly, and he didn't give any advice. But he said, well, if somebody is dependent, then they're a bit like a man with a ball and chain attached to their ankle, and they're sort of stuck. And they can move a little bit in this direction or a little bit in that direction, but not very far. He said, And that's all I remember of Bhante's advice, or non-advice to me, in the matter of leaving my wife or not. So, since then I've hardly seen Bhante. I've been ordained probably 16 years, but I don't think we've met hardly at all since then. I've never particularly felt the need to meet him. It's not like he's my teacher and he has the answers and I must meet him. I've simply been happily a member of his Sangha, with him there in the background, as a teacher, but not as a personal teacher. I've looked to my friends for personal teaching.